Hey there YouTube, Crispy Charizard here, and today I'm going to be discussing my theory for how the Pokedex actually works. And I'm referring to the problem that some people have noticed. They are wondering, simply, whether the information that you have in the Pokedex was in it originally, and that it is, revealed to you as you catch more Pokemon, or if it actually procures that information and collects that data as you catch more Pokemon, meaning the information was not in the device originally. And the reason this is significant is because of what Professor Oak, the creator of the original Pokedex, has mentioned. He says that he caught many Pokemon in his youth, and that in the original games he says that he only has these 3 left, and he gives you one of them, Kanto starters. But if he caught all those Pokemon that he mentioned, how come when he gives you a Pokedex, it's blank? I believe that in the video game, because the anime is very different when it comes to the Pokedex. In the video game, Pokedex is not entirely empty, but it's not entirely full. When you receive a Pokedex, it just appears empty to you. All the information that is on each Pokemon, which includes stuff like height, weight, cry, footprint in certain generations, location, area, other forms, and a picture of the Pokemon, stuff like that. All of that is, revealed to you as you either see a Pokemon, and more so if you catch a Pokemon. But the thing that I am specifically referring to is the 2 or 3 sentences that typically describe Pokemon in their Pokedex entries. For example, when you first see a Pokemon in the anime, for example, Ash would take out his Pokedex, and the Pokedex would just give you 2 or 3 sentences describing it. Very simple, but not the most scientific, because there's stuff about Pokemon that you would expect would be more than just 2 or 3 sentences. So what I think is that originally, when Professor Oak and his other associates and the people who write those 2 or 3 sentence entries, they traveled the world the best they could. They saw as many Pokemon as they can, and mainly they stick to their respective regions. We could guess that this is the Pokemon professor in each region who has provided these entries, more or less. And the reason it's only 2 or 3 sentences is because it's a very preliminary survey of Pokemon. For example, in an episode of the original series, they find this other professor, and he specifies in Slowpoke. And the Pokedex back then called Slowpoke a dopey Pokemon, and they asked him why they call him a dopey Pokemon, and he says, "Oh, one of my one of my assistants happened to have written that entry." So as you can see, it is not as much scientific as just a very, very brief survey when it comes to the anime's way of, or maybe even the video game's way of writing those short entries. Those short entries, which contain a lot of random information that people enjoy reading from time to time, sometimes is a little strange, sometimes it's downright weird. Some are very creepy. Lots of YouTubers have videos describing the really creepy and almost downright inappropriate Pokedex entries for certain Pokemon, especially the more ghost types. My point is that the Pokedex itself did not create that information out of thin air. You cannot just point your Pokedex at a Pokemon and it decides to, call it dopey, or say it is, the creator of the universe, or, lives in an alternate dimension, and, its history, its anatomy, its, rumors, its, legends. Stuff like that was in the Pokedex, put there by its designer, like Professor Oak, for example. And you can only see that information once you catch a Pokemon. Now, if you only see a Pokemon, sure, you get to see what it looks like in the Pokedex and where to find it and other stuff like that, but you don't get its actual entry until you catch the Pokedex, as seen in, catch the Pokemon, as seen in the video game. Now, the anime, of course, works very differently. In the anime, you don't need to catch a Pokemon to get an entry, because, that entry is given to you freely. So I believe that in the anime, while the Pokedex does gather data, it already has plenty inside of it. While in the video game, you're the one gathering the data more more from the beginning, like you're like the main source of information. Now, it's possible that Pokedexes are connected wirelessly, like through some sort of personal internet like connection to like a server or something, and they're connected, and that's how you get the data back to your professor, you know, which explains how they know your Pokedex data when you call them on your PC. Basically, maybe you connect it to the PC, maybe it's wireless, but either way, you can send your information in your progress back to them. Which makes sense, because you're doing this for them to gather as much information as possible. Now, many people wonder, is it true that, like, none of these Pokemon were ever even seen before I recorded them in my Pokedex? Well, no, that's not true. Even if you're the only person in the region currently with a Pokedex, which is possible in some regions in the video game, my point is that the information that you're gathering isn't known by everyone. I dare say that the main character is probably the only one who's run into certain legendary and mythical Pokemon. If you run into a legendary Pokemon and you get an entry for it, how did your professor originally write that data for them? Does that mean they met them before? Also, where did the entries come from? And this applies to all 7 regions so far. I mean, you think you're the first to meet Dialga? Well, then how did, for example, Professor Rowan have an entry for it in his Pokedex? Then there's the factor of recognizing how it looks like. If you meet Dialga and you point your Pokedex at it, it has to recognize it from previous data. The Pokedex is starting to seem more and more unscientific and just, you know, something to like accept when it comes to video games and anime. It's almost as if we're just supposed to accept it and simply not question how it works. But I'm trying to figure out how it works. There are many issues. Back to my example. Let's say you actually capture Dialga, and it gives you a entry for Dialga, saying it's the Lord of Time and that time flows while your heart beats. I'm sure I read that somewhere. First of all, the reason that your Pokedex even recognizes Dialga's image, possibly out of the data input. So even if it never saw Dialga before, if you see Dialga for the first time and your Pokedex takes an image of it, applies the name to the image using some sort of common sense, or maybe you do it, I don't know. The entry itself was probably input into the Pokedex, just in case, ahead of time, to be applied with that image once you catch it. With that entry, of course, in the video game not being available until you catch it. Of course, I'm sure that in the anime, all Pokemon in a region are available, so you just have to point your Pokedex to it and it'll give you some information. Now, the thing that I like a lot about the Pokedex, it's the no data thing that happens. In the anime, no Pokedex owned by Ash has been a national Pokedex. I'm sure you remember many occasions where he sees a Pokemon that he's never seen before, but it's not from the region he's currently in, it's from a region he's yet to visit. Therefore, the Pokedex has no data, and it says no data, and it shows a question mark. This has happened on many occasions. This has happened with Ho-Oh, maybe Togepi, when Gary met Mewtwo for the first time. It happened with Mewtwo, but that's not really because it's not from the region, but more like it's never been recorded or seen by Professor Oak when he was traveling as a youngster. The region, of course, he's never met Mewtwo because it probably didn't exist at all times, so also happened on many other occasions. I'm sure that it said no data when he met Alexis's Helioptile and Gogoat and Noivern. And of course in the movies, he never bothers to take out his Pokedex, but of course we know that in movies where he met Pokemon like Lucario for the first time, or Zorua and Zoroark, and Diancie and all those other Pokemon like Volcanion, he never bothers with the Pokedex in the movies, but if he did, it would probably say no data because the region he's currently in probably has no data on a Pokemon because it's from a different region that he's yet to visit. Now, I'd like to remind you all the plot of the 3rd Pokemon movie where Professor Oak, when he was a child, was traveling somewhere in the Johto region. And this is probably when he first met many Pokemon for the first time. And the only Pokemon we know he had was a Charmeleon in a very primitive Pokeball. He was warped to the future by Celebi, and he meets Ash, Brock, and Misty Ash explains to him how the Pokedex works, and that gives him the idea for creating the Pokedex when he's older. So this is an example of a bootstrap paradox. A very fun, very popular form of paradox, but still, that means that the idea for the Pokedex came out of nowhere. Professor Oak got it from Ash when he traveled to the future, and Ash, of course, has a Pokedex from Professor Oak, who created it from the idea when he was a child when he traveled to the future by means of Celebi and met Ash and his Pokedex. But even if the idea for the Pokedex came out of nowhere, you can't avoid paradoxes when you time travel, because apparently time travel happens a lot in Pokemon. Not that it matters. It's just a fun bit of trivia. Basically, to answer the question that many people ask about how, if Professor Oak gathered so much information, how come the Pokedex is empty? Well, it's not completely empty. The information is in there, but you have to meet the Pokemon again to access it. And the point of this is that you have to gather more data. Not all Pokemon are identical. As many people have realized, Pokemon come in different sizes and weights. If you play Pokemon Go, this is exaggerated to the extreme, with some Pokemon accidentally having a weight of 0.0 kilograms. As I've heard about that happening in Pokemon Go. But like in reality, a Pokemon, of course, would not be identical to all others of its same species. Some Pikachu might be a little bigger than others, or more realistically, some Onix might be bigger than others. And the point of you gathering Pokedex along with other trainers in the world is so that you could gather as much data as possible, because even if we live in the 21st century, or whenever Ash is living in the anime, Pokemon have not been studied like this until recently. Professor Oak is probably the first person to even make an encyclopedia for Pokemon. So before him, people, viewed Pokemon from a very primitive point of view when it comes to scientific data gathering. And sure, every generation the Pokedex gets more and more advanced, but it still works the exact same way. You see a Pokemon, you get an entry if you catch it, or you simply get its image and its habitat if you see it. If you catch them all, good for you. That's the goal. And basically, when he was a child, Professor Oak wrote these short 2 to 3 sentence entries for as many Pokemon as he could. Of course, this only applies to mainly Kanto Pokemon, because his Pokedex had no data originally on Pokemon like Togepi and Ho-Oh and Mewtwo. Those Pokemon probably have very little information in the Pokedex in the anime, even now. Of course, in the video game, when you catch Mewtwo, you immediately get information about it. Probably because the video game universe is a little different from the anime universe. In the video game universe, I can almost guess that Mewtwo's creator somehow is acquainted with Professor Oak, or at least Professor Oak has heard about him. While on the other hand, in the anime, Mr. Fuji, or whoever created Mewtwo, had no means of getting his information out. So when you see a Mewtwo, your Pokedex says no data. And the main purpose of gathering data on Pokemon is to get the overall average of its specific information. So, like I mentioned, different members of the same species may be different sizes, but that one size, whether it's a height or weight, in the Pokedex is the average of everything gathered. And even though it is gathering data, the image is already in there based on the information already programmed into the Pokedex when you first get it. So the programmed information that was already in there is probably the recognition software for recognizing a Pokemon for the first time, as well as those 2 to 3 sentences which is given on a Pokemon. So whether it be anime or video game, those 2 to 3 sentences that were probably written by assistants or professors will be given once you see it in the anime or catch it in the video game. And those entries, which are fun to read, and I may make a video on that in the future, is basically a very, very short, fun bit of information on that Pokemon. Sometimes it's significant to their lore, sometimes it's just plain, weird. The Pokedex is not writing this information out of thin air, it is accessing it from the information already programmed into it, which is not extensive because it was basically Professor Oak and other people like him just jotting down notes while observing Pokemon in the wild. Is all they could do in their time before the invention of the Pokedex. So basically, they were basically Pokemon sketch artists, like as is shown as he was when he was a child in the third Pokemon movie as a young Sam. I hope this information cleared some stuff up for you young Pokemon beginners. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for future videos.